The galaxy was a strange and dangerous place, teeming with all kinds of life forms that would make even the bravest human soldiers think twice. But none of that seemed to matter to Captain Elias Ward. His unit described him with awe and apprehension, recounting tales of his daring, like the time he flew his shuttle through a meteor storm to save a stranded crew. Yet, it was Elias who had been chosen for a mission so outlandish, so mind-bogglingly risky, that even his closest allies had begged him to refuse. "You're crazy if you think this will work," Lieutenant Morales had said, shaking his head as Elias packed his gear. "A human bonding with a Cathanian? They're 8 feet tall, Elias. They're formidable, all muscle and unyielding resolve, known for toppling entire armies with calculated ferocity. Bonding isn't in their nature, domination is their creed." Elias had laughed, his trademark grin plastered across his face. "They said the same thing about the Martian Reconciliation Treaty, Morales. Sometimes, you just have to shake hands with the impossible." Except this time, it wasn't a handshake. It was something much more intimate, much more dangerous. The Cathanians were not just a warrior race, they were the warrior race. Towering blue-skinned giants with piercing silver eyes, they were built for combat in a way no human could ever hope to match. Their culture revolved around strength, loyalty, and a brutal code of honor. To bond with one of them, a process that went far beyond any human concept of camaraderie, meant merging not just lives, but minds. It was the kind of connection that left no secrets, no boundaries. For the Cathanians, it was sacred. For humanity, it was uncharted territory. And Elias was about to dive in headfirst. The first time he saw her, his breath caught in his throat. Naira was everything the Cathanians were rumored to be and more. 8 feet of raw, coiled power. Her long white hair flowed like silk under the harsh desert sun of Tau Ceti Prime, and her silver eyes seemed to pierce straight through him. She didn't speak at first. She just watched, her expression unreadable, her stance like that of a predator sizing up prey. Elias felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. "You are the human." Her voice was low and resonant, carrying the weight of 1,000 battles fought and won. "Captain Elias Ward," he said, standing as straight as he could despite the fact that her presence made him feel like a child. "I've been assigned to, well, you know, the whole bonding thing." She tilted her head, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her otherwise stern expression. "The whole bonding thing," she repeated, as if tasting the words. "You have courage, human. Perhaps even foolishness. We shall see which one defines you." The bonding ceremony was held under the twin moons of Tau Ceti Prime. It was a ritual steeped in Cathanian tradition, involving intricate symbols drawn in glowing sands and chants that seemed to vibrate through Elias's very bones. Naira stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding. Elias could feel the weight of 100 Cathanian eyes on him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. He was an intruder, a fragile outsider daring to step into their sacred space. As the chants reached a crescendo, Naira extended her hand. Her piercing silver eyes met his, and in that charged moment, he saw a vulnerability born from centuries of carrying the expectations of her people. "Do not take this lightly, human. Once it begins, there is no going back." Elias swallowed hard. "I'm ready." Their hands touched, and everything changed. It felt like a tempest ripping through his soul, a torrent of raw emotion and energy that left him breathless. A flood of images, emotions, and sensations crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave. He saw her battles, her triumphs, her losses. He felt the weight of her people's expectations, the pain of her scars both visible and hidden. And beneath it all, he sensed something deeper, a loneliness so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. But it wasn't just her. She was feeling him too. He could feel her probing his mind, sifting through his memories, his fears, his dreams. She saw the moment he'd enlisted in the Earth Defense Corps, the day he'd lost his brother in the Orion skirmish, the nights he'd spent staring at the stars, wondering if humanity would ever find its place among them. When it was over, he was gasping for air, his knees buckling under the weight of it all. Naira, for her part, seemed equally shaken, though she hid it well. "You are more than I expected," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "But this is only the beginning. The bond is forged, but it must be tested. The tests began the next day. Naira's idea of testing the bond involved what Elias could only describe as sheer madness. They trained together in the blistering heat, sparred with weapons that could cleave a human in half, and hunted the predatory beasts that roamed the deserts of Tau Ceti Prime. Every challenge pushed Elias to his limits and beyond. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Naira was holding back, that she was testing not just his strength, but his resolve. "You fight well for a human," she said after one particularly grueling sparring session. "But strength alone will not sustain the bond. Trust is required. Loyalty. Would you truly stand by me, even when the galaxy itself turns against us?" "You don't even have to ask," Elias said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "If this bond means anything, it means I'm all in. No matter what." Her gaze softened, just a fraction. "Then perhaps there is hope for you yet." But trust was a two-way street, and Elias quickly learned that Naira had her own walls to break down. One night, as they sat by a fire under the twin moons, he dared to ask her about the loneliness he'd felt during the bonding. "You carry it like a weight," he said. "Why?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Because I am the last of my line. My people expect greatness from me, yet I cannot give them what they desire most. I cannot fall. I cannot fail. And yet, the weight of it is unbearable." Elias reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Naira. That's the whole point of this bond, isn't it? Together, we shoulder the weight, intertwining our strengths to bear a burden that once seemed impossible to carry alone." Her silver eyes met his, and for the first time, he thought he saw something resembling gratitude. Perhaps human. Perhaps. As the days turned into weeks, their bond deepened in ways Elias could never have imagined. He began to sense her emotions before she even spoke, to anticipate her movements in battle. And she, in turn, seemed to understand him on a level no one else ever had. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. And it was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have foreseen. The peace of Tau Ceti Prime was shattered on a blistering afternoon. The Cathanian outpost where Elias and Naira had been training suddenly buzzed with frantic activity. The sky, once a serene expanse of twin suns and drifting clouds, darkened with the shadows of incoming ships. Human and Cathanian alike stood frozen as the alarms blared, signaling an approaching threat. Elias grabbed his rifle, his instincts kicking in. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Naira's expression hardened. "Scavengers and killers, the Rayleigh exploit weakness with surgical precision. They strike at supply lines, destroy infrastructure, and leave survivors too crippled to retaliate. They strike at the weak and the distracted." She turned to him, her silver eyes burning with resolve. "They won't find us either." The Rayleigh were notorious across the galaxy, a race of nomadic marauders who once razed the industrial colonies of Vega Prime in a single night, feared for their ruthless efficiency and cloaking technology that rendered them invisible to most detection systems until it was too late. Even a Cathanian warband would think twice before engaging them. But Naira wasn't one to retreat, and Elias, bound to her by their deepening connection, felt her determination like a fire in his chest. The outpost's defenses roared to life. Massive cannons swiveled toward the sky, firing bursts of plasma at the descending ships. The Rayleigh crafts shimmered into visibility as they dodged and weaved through the barrage. Smaller, insect-like vessels broke off, landing near the perimeter. "They're testing us," Naira muttered, gripping the hilt of her massive blade. "We'll show them their mistake." Elias stayed close to her, his rifle steady in his hands. The bond between them hummed like a live wire. He could feel her anticipation, her readiness to unleash the fury of her people. In turn, he focused his thoughts, projecting calm and strategy to balance her fire. The first wave of Rayleigh attackers poured over the dunes, their sleek, insectoid forms bristling with weapons. Naira charged without hesitation, her blade a blur of silver light. Elias followed, his rifle firing precise bursts that took down the smaller attackers trying to flank her. Their movements were synchronized in a way that felt almost supernatural. She would dodge just as he covered her, and he would pivot just in time to follow her next strike. It was as if they shared one mind, each anticipating the other's moves with uncanny precision. At one point, Elias ducked just as Naira's blade swept over his head, and their shared glance was one of mutual understanding and surprise at their seamless coordination. "Elias, behind you." Naira's voice rang in his head as much as in his ears. He spun, his rifle already aimed at a rayleigh that had emerged from the sand. The creature's carapace shattered under his shot, and he nodded to Naira in silent thanks. The battle raged for hours. The rayleigh were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. But the bond between Elias and Naira proved to be their greatest weapon. Where other defenders faltered, the two of them stood firm, their combined strength and coordination turning the tide. The other Cathanians began to rally around them, inspired by their example. "They're falling back," shouted a Cathanian warrior as the rayleigh ships began to lift off, their scavenged spoils in tow. Naira growled in frustration. "They will return. They always do. They'll bring more ships, more death." Elias placed a hand on her arm. "Then we'll be ready. We've shown them what happens when they pick the wrong fight." Despite the victory, the outpost was left battered. Supplies were low, morale was frayed, and the Cathanian leaders convened to discuss their next move. Elias and Naira were summoned to the central chamber, where the atmosphere was tense with unease. "Your bond has proven effective," rumbled an elder Cathanian, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. "But it also marks you as a target. The rayleigh are not fools. They will seek to sever the bond, to weaken us through you." Elias straightened, meeting the elder's gaze. "Let them try. They'll find we're not so easily broken." Naira's hand rested lightly on the hilt of her blade. "We must act, not wait for them to strike again. The rayleigh must learn fear." The elders murmured among themselves. Finally, the leader spoke. "There is a rayleigh warlord known as Kael Vorth. His fleet commands this sector. If you wish to teach them fear, then he must fall." Elias felt a surge of determination from Naira through the bond. He nodded. "Where do we find him?" The mission to locate Kael Vorth's fleet took them deep into uncharted space. Elias and Naira led a small, elite team of Cathanian warriors, their ship bristling with weaponry but relying on stealth to evade detection. The bond between the two of them grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just a connection anymore, it was a lifeline, a source of strength neither of them could explain. During the long, quiet stretches aboard the ship, Naira began to open up, sharing fragments of her past, a childhood of rigorous training, the loss of a mentor in battle, and the crushing weight of her lineage in subdued conversations that stretched late into the night. "My people's pride has always been our strength, but it blinds us too," she admitted one evening, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Your people are different. Adaptive. Resilient in ways we do not understand." "We've had to be," Elias said. "We've spent centuries just trying to survive, even against ourselves. Maybe that's why this bond works. We balance each other out." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Perhaps." When they finally located the rayleigh fleet, it was every bit as imposing as the elders had warned. Hundreds of ships formed a massive armada, their silhouettes blotting out the stars. At its center was Kael Vorth's flagship, a fortress of jagged metal and pulsing energy. "This is madness," muttered one of the warriors. "How can we hope to take on a force like this?" Naira's voice was calm but firm. "We don't fight them head-on. We strike where it hurts most. Elias, you've studied their tactics. Where do we begin?" Elias scanned the fleet, his mind racing. Through the bond, he could feel Naira's unwavering trust in him, and it gave him clarity. Their supply lines. The smaller ships ferrying resources to the flagship. If we take those out, they'll be vulnerable. The plan was set into motion. Their ship moved like a phantom, darting between patrols and targeting the supply vessels. Each strike was surgical, crippling the rayleigh's ability to maintain their fleet. The bond between Elias and Naira guided them, their actions seamless and precise. But Kael Vorth was no fool. The warlord soon realized he was being hunted and responded with ruthless precision, deploying decoy ships and ambush squads that drained their resources and frayed the nerves of Elias and Nyra's team, pushing them to the brink of exhaustion. As the Cathanian team prepared for their final assault on the flagship, an ambush caught them off guard. Their ship was boarded, and the corridors erupted in chaos. Elias and Nyra fought side by side, their movements perfectly in sync. But the Raylyth were cunning, and their numbers overwhelmed even the most skilled warriors. As the battle raged, Elias felt a surge of desperation through the bond. Nyra was hurt, her movements slowing as she took a glancing blow from an energy blade. "Stay with me," Elias urged, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're not done yet." Nyra gritted her teeth, nodding as she pushed through the pain. Together, they carved a path through the enemy, reaching the heart of the ship. But the cost had been high, and the final confrontation with Kael Vorth loomed ahead like a dark storm on the horizon. The dimly lit corridors of Kael Vorth's flagship loomed before them like the maw of a beast. Elias could feel the oppressive weight of the ship's atmosphere pressing down on him. Beside him, Nyra moved with silent determination, her blade glinting faintly in the flickering emergency lights. The bond between them thrummed with an urgent rhythm, a shared pulse of focus and fear. "We're close to the command center," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. "Once we take out Vorth, the fleet will be in chaos." Nyra nodded, her silver eyes scanning their surroundings. "And if we fail, the galaxy will lose more than just 2 lives. The Raylyth will make an example of us." The reminder of the stakes only fueled Elias' resolve. Together, they pressed forward, navigating the labyrinth of the enemy vessel. Each step was calculated, their movements guided by both instinct and the bond's unspoken communication. The remaining members of their team fanned out behind them, covering their flanks. Suddenly, the bond flared with a warning. Nyra moved before Elias could react, her blade slicing through the shadows as a Raylyth soldier lunged at them. The alien's weapon clattered to the floor as its body crumpled, and Nyra turned to Elias with a sharp look. "They know we're here," she said, her voice low but urgent. "We need to move quickly." They picked up the pace, their boots echoing faintly on the metallic floors. Alarms blared in the distance, a cacophony of sound that signaled the ship's heightened alertness. As they neared the command center, the corridors became more heavily guarded. The Raylyth soldiers were no longer mindless drones, these were elite fighters, their movements coordinated and deadly. "Stay sharp," Elias murmured, raising his rifle. "They're not going to let us waltz in." The ensuing firefight was brutal. Plasma bolts ricocheted off walls, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burning metal and flesh. Elias and Nyra moved as one, their bond guiding them through the chaos. He covered her with precision shots while she cut down enemies with lethal grace. The other Cathanian warriors fought valiantly, their cries of battle echoing through the halls. But the Raylyth were relentless. For every soldier they felled, 2 more seemed to take their place. Elias felt the strain creeping into his muscles, the fatigue gnawing at the edges of his focus. Through the bond, he sensed Nyra's own exhaustion, though she hid it well. "Elias," her voice rang in his mind, steady despite the chaos, "we cannot sustain this. We must end it now." He nodded, his gaze locking onto a heavy blast door at the end of the corridor. "That's it," he said aloud. "The command center." They pushed forward with renewed determination, their team forming a protective barrier around them. Nyra charged ahead, her blade a whirlwind of destruction. Elias followed close behind, his rifle taking out anything she left standing. When they reached the door, Nyra plunged her blade into its control panel, sparks flying as she forced it open. The command center was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. It was a cavernous room, dominated by a massive viewport that framed the stars and the scattered remnants of the Raylyth fleet. At the center of the room stood Kael Vorth. The Raylyth warlord was even more imposing than the reports had suggested. His towering, insectoid form was encased in jagged armor, and his multifaceted eyes gleamed with malice. He turned to face them, his mandibles clicking in what could only be described as a mocking smile. "You have come far, little warriors," Vorth said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "But this is where your journey ends." Nyra stepped forward, her blade raised. "Your reign of terror ends today, Vorth." The galaxy will no longer live in fear of you. Vorth laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the command center. Brave words from a dying race. Your bond may make you strong, but it also makes you predictable. Elias felt a ripple of doubt through the bond, but he pushed it aside. Predictable doesn't mean beatable, he said, leveling his rifle at the warlord. Let's see how you handle a fair fight. The battle was unlike anything Elias had experienced. Vorth was a whirlwind of power and precision, his movements almost too fast to track. Naira met him head-on, her blade clashing against his claws in a shower of sparks. Elias provided cover, his shots forcing Vorth to stay on the defensive. But the warlord was right about one thing: the bond made them predictable. Vorth seemed to anticipate their every move, exploiting the synchronicity that had been their greatest strength. He drove them back, his strikes relentless and devastating. Elias, we must adapt, Naira said through the bond, her voice tinged with urgency. He reads our patterns. We must break them. Elias nodded, his mind racing. They needed to disrupt their rhythm, to act unpredictably. He fired a shot at the ceiling above Vorth, causing debris to rain down. Naira used the distraction to land a blow, her blade slicing through one of Vorth's armored limbs. The warlord roared in pain, his movements faltering for a split second. It's working, Elias thought, and Naira's agreement resonated through the bond. The tide of the battle began to shift. They stopped relying solely on their bond and instead used it as a foundation for improvisation. Elias took risks, darting in and out of cover, while Naira's strikes became erratic and unpredictable. Vorth's confidence wavered, his frustration evident in his increasingly desperate attacks. Finally, with a coordinated effort, they landed the finishing blow. Naira's blade pierced Vorth's chest just as Elias fired a shot that struck his exposed head. The warlord collapsed, his massive form crumpling to the floor with a resounding thud. For a moment, there was only silence. Elias and Naira stood over Vorth's body, their breaths heavy, their bond humming with shared relief. It is done, Naira said, her voice soft but resolute. Elias nodded, his gaze shifting to the viewport. The Raylyth fleet, now leaderless, was in disarray. We've given the galaxy a fighting chance, he said. Their victory was hard-won, but the war was far from over. As they prepared to leave the command center, Elias felt a sense of unease through the bond. Naira shared his sentiment, her expression grim. Vorth may be dead, she said, but the Raylyth will not fall so easily. We've made a powerful enemy, Elias. He placed a hand on her shoulder, their bond a steady anchor. Then we'll face them together. No matter what comes next. The stars stretched out before them as they left the flagship, their future uncertain but their resolve unwavering. Returning to Tau Ceti Prime brought a mix of relief and unease. The sight of the battered outpost against the backdrop of twin moons was a stark reminder of the sacrifices made and the battles still ahead. Though the Raylyth fleet was leaderless and scattered, their shadow lingered over Elias and Naira like an unspoken threat. Their victory over Kael Vorth had shaken the Raylyth, but it had also united them in a thirst for vengeance. The galaxy's fragile peace hung by a thread, and the bond between human and Caethanian would be tested like never before. As they descended onto the outpost, they were greeted with cheers and reverence. Caethanian warriors bowed in respect, and human commanders saluted the pair. But beneath the celebration was an undercurrent of tension. The alliance between humanity and the Caethanians was still new, and many wondered if the bond Elias and Naira had forged was a one-time miracle or the beginning of a new era. That evening, as the twin moons cast their pale light over the desert, Elias and Naira stood atop a cliff overlooking the camp. The stars stretched endlessly above them, a reminder of both the vastness of the galaxy and the challenges yet to come. We've changed something, Elias said, breaking the silence. I don't know if it's for the better or worse, but there's no going back now. Naira's gaze was fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. The galaxy fears change, she said. But without it, we are doomed to repeat our failures. Your people, showed me that. Elias turned to her, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? She hesitated, searching for the right words. The Caethanians have always been bound by tradition, by pride. Strength was all that mattered. But strength alone did not save us from the Rayleigh. It was your resilience, your willingness to adapt, that turned the tide. That bond, she paused, her silver eyes meeting his. That bond taught me there is power in unity, in trust. Elias felt a warmth in his chest, the bond resonating with her words. I learned from you too, Naira, he said. You showed me that courage isn't just about fighting. It's about standing for something bigger than yourself. Even when it's terrifying. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the bond between them a steady presence. Then Naira spoke again, her voice soft but firm. The Rayleigh will come again. And when they do, we must be ready. But this time, they won't face just warriors. They will face a galaxy united by something greater. Elias nodded, his resolve firm. Then we keep fighting. Not just for survival, but for a future where bonds like ours aren't the exception. The next day, Elias and Naira addressed a gathering of human and Cathanian leaders. The air was heavy with anticipation as they stood side by side, their bond a living symbol of what could be achieved through unity. Today, we stand as proof that trust can overcome fear, Elias said, his voice steady and clear. Humanity and the Cathanians are stronger together. The Rayleigh's onslaught showed us the devastating cost of division, entire colonies reduced to ash, families torn apart, and alliances shattered. Now it's up to us to rebuild stronger, ensuring such weakness is never exploited again. Naira stepped forward, her commanding presence silencing the crowd. Strength is not measured by what we can destroy, but by what we can protect. The bond between Elias and I is not unique. It is the beginning. If we dare to trust, to fight for each other instead of against each other, then the Rayleigh will have no place in this galaxy. The crowd erupted into applause, a mixture of roars and cheers that echoed across the desert. It wasn't just a celebration of their victory, it was a declaration of hope. In the weeks that followed, the outpost became a beacon of cooperation. Humans and Cathanians worked shoulder to shoulder, their shared efforts visible in every project, from rebuilding shattered infrastructure to devising strategies in tense, late-night planning sessions. Their growing camaraderie was a beacon of hope amidst the uncertainty. The bond between Elias and Naira became a symbol, inspiring others to forge their own connections across species and cultures. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire, Naira joined him, her blade resting against her shoulder. Naira's voice was soft, her silver eyes searching his face for reassurance. Do you truly believe it? She asked, her tone carrying both doubt and the fragile hope that their bond had forged in battle. He looked at her, surprised. Believe what? That we can change the galaxy. Elias smiled, the firelight dancing in his eyes. I believe we already have. Their journey had been one of trials and sacrifices, but it had also been one of discovery. Together, they had forged a bond that transcended fear and prejudice, proving that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, hope could take root. As the stars above them shimmered like scattered diamonds, Elias and Naira knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time, they faced the future with something neither had ever truly known, the certainty that they would never face it alone. Moral: true strength lies not in domination but in unity. It is through bonds of trust and understanding that even the widest divides can be bridged. Together, we can shape a future where cooperation triumphs over conflict, a vision worth every sacrifice.